Here I suggest that perhaps it was discourse itself that could be the answer. Discourse being the intertextual dialogue that occurs among individual state communities. My argument seeks to argue how and why pedagogical transformation must occur and why it is necessary to re-explore the manner in which one considers international politics and national security. To properly frame my discussion, it is paramount to define security studies. One popular definition offers that security study be defined as a study of threats, uses, and control of military force. But I found that such a definition tended to marginalize other groups, such as the neo-realists and social constructionists. For the purpose of a more inclusive analysis, I define security studies as the inquiry into the nature, effects, causes, and prevention of war. It was my hope that this definition would erode the traditional place of the state as the privileged entity of security studies. In order to move forward with my recommendation for a rewritten pedagogy, I first sought to write a history of security studies. I entitled the section An Unfulfilled Legacy, which should portray my view towards it. The survey sought to illuminate times in which the study became increasingly rigid, times where they were showing real wealth and the things that distracted the potentials for great progress. In my historical art overview, a large focus was paid to the way in which the Cold War itself affected security studies. The second section of my article was entitled Recontextualizing an Era, Periodizing the Late 20th Century Cold War. As it relates to periodicity, I find that the Cold War embodies a unique point of view. The Cold War was essentially the foreign policy struggles of the United States against the regime of communism. There, the United States championed its capitalistic system over the closed market, Soviet Union, and satellite territories. The term Cold War was coined by the United States to denote the historical span when it engaged with the Soviet Union in a nuclear arms race to gain power and construct an enclosed region of influence. Today, the material conditions of contemporary times hint upon the global supremacy of the United States and the expanse of multinational corporations. Thus, I felt that much value was to be found buried within and beyond the shelves of Cold War scholarship. A particular influence on culture that I studied was postmodernism. Whether or not you agree that a postmodern switch has begun, I analyzed what I termed the postmodern effect, which presumably occurred following entry into the atomic age and end of World War II. One example I discussed was the existence of a thematic paranoia and tendencies toward conspiracy that constituted the postmodern complexion and arguably continue to constitute it today. It was noted that never before had the United States witnessed so many operational scenarios in which secret missions were launched and espionage, double agents, and secret weaponry, disguised identities, and forged documentation permeated international intelligence gathering. Notions of conspiratory intentions were furthered by events such as Truman's 1948 doctrine of plausible deniability, the CIA's plan to assassinate Fidel Castro in 1960, and President Eisenhower's denial of any involvement in that activity. Truly, these instances convert smoothly into their postmodern context and really help current individuals contextualize the era in a way that much scholarship overlooks. The section really is quite interesting, and I recommend that if anyone's going to read my paper today, at least read this section if they're still wanting to comprehend what in fact the Cold War means, or what in fact the linguistic shape of Cold War actually entails. In my third section entitled Rethinking Security Studies, Proposals, Implications, and Considerations, I discussed the things that may be learned from the Cold War and how these things may benefit post-Cold War studies. For instance, I argued that certain foundational considerations, such as that, number one, redefining security studies would involve a shift in institutional discourse, and certain issues would need to be elevated within the political realm. Two, before a pedagogical shift can be made, the players themselves must be plainly articulated. Three, identify areas or steps that may be taken to cultivate cooperation or spotlight current cooperative dynamics in the international system, as I did identify the presence of the international system of contemporary times. Number four, this is what is needed, that what is needed for a broader field of inquiry. For instance, the failure to incorporate a psychological viewpoint demonstrates the sheer narrowness and disciplinary rigidity of the security survey to date. Finally, I take on the popular realist school of thought arguing the post-Cold War world. A world once riddled with international rivalries, arms races, and power grabs has become more globalized, and much of its hostile sentiments have slowly eroded, and there has seen an increase in multilateral efforts in a variety of international institutions, and instead of maintaining realism, it appears more beneficial to adopt a theory capable of managing politics within the transnational community as well as the global level. This theory is precisely the theory I set out to detail, and following its elaboration, recommended ultra-modern security studies pedagogy in my final section entitled Primary Conclusions, Rewriting Contemporary Practices. In order to reconcile my initial concern, it appeared that I needed to pinpoint or create a method who boasted a certain worldly knowledge that was needed to identify how culture, psychology, personality, etc. all contributed to scenarios that might impact these war. Hence, I argued that, at very least, interdisciplinarity, which is the combination, integration, and cooperation of numerous yet interrelated disciplines, ought to be the institutional pursuit that is most highly rewarded, rather than just focusing and mastering one discipline. Understanding of this section is quite long and very detailed. I tried to knowledge, the will, with hope, will be equipped with a more universal portrait of security, although I hesitate to use the rhetoric of universality. A broader perspective will make it possible for the security scholar to determine the parameters of a specific security framework, and rather than employing a specific political theory, one could use a universal outlook to determine the proper essentiality of one's own self-generated theory. I thank you for your attention. Truly, this article was